Welcome to today's webinar, Just Suburbs, Creating Equitable Opportunities in Suburban Development, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I am the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter for Smart Growth news and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or of the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Just Suburbs, Creating Equitable Opportunities in Suburban Development. You can also search for event number 9202615. I would like to acknowledge our partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and create solutions to its complex problems. So to get started today, our speakers are Jason Beske, David Dixon, and Eric Anthony Johnson. Jason Beske is a senior urban designer and planner for Stantec's Urban Places in Arlington, Virginia. He has nearly 20 years of experience leading transformative initiatives that have helped communities across the United States manage growth, build economic competitiveness, promote equity, and enhance livability. He serves as adjunct professor at Virginia Tech's National Capital Region campus and is chair of APA's National Planning Conference Committee. Jason's recent publication, Suburban Remix, Creating the Next Generation of Urban Places with David Dixon, examines the rise of walkable urbanism in the new suburban era. Community engagement, placemaking, and social equity are the core of his planning and urban design practice and instruction. David Dixon leads planning and urban design for Stantec's Urban Places, an interdisciplinary team that helps cities and suburbs alike thrive by harnessing the growing demand for urban life. Residential Architecture magazine named David to their Hall of Fame as the person we call to ask about cities. In recent years, he has led planning in post-Katrina New Orleans, transformed strip malls into new suburban downtowns, and initiated a broad reappraisal of the role of density in building more livable, resilient, and equitable communities. His work has won national awards from the AIA, CNU, International Downtown Association, and ASLA. He is also co-author of Urban Design for an Urban Century, Placemaking for People, which was first published by Wiley in 2009. Dr. Eric Anthony Johnson is an accomplished urban development leader, consistently delivering results over his career by leveraging a solid academic, real estate development, community engagement, and policy background. In his current role as the Chief of Economic Development, Housing, and Neighborhood Services for the City of Dallas, Texas, Eric oversees housing, urban planning and design, historic preservation, and economic development. In 2019, he was chosen to serve as a Michael Rubin, our Community Fellow through the Local Initiative Support Corporation, for his innovative work in affordable housing strategy. In his previous role as the Community Development Director for the City of Bloomington, Minnesota, Eric was responsible for the divisions of real estate assessment, building and inspections, environmental health, planning and development review, housing, and other planning and infrastructure functions. Following this discussion, Jason, Eric, and David will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. But before we begin, we're going to start with a couple of poll questions. And those who have joined us in the past know that if you're not able to vote in the poll because you can't click on it, make sure that you've clicked on the full view button in the control panel, and you should get to the correct screen. So with that, now we're going to launch a couple polls. The first one is, who are you employed by? And you can see the options on your screen. Select public, private sector, nonprofit, self, or other. And we'll give you a few seconds here to respond, and then we'll close it. Just take another second or two. Looks like many have voted here. We'll open it up shortly, and I don't think people on the call will be surprised. 62% public sector, 18% private, and then 7% for nonprofit, self, and other. And we'll launch our second question. Okay, and here is a question about race by census category, and please select one of these. Give everybody a little time to respond. Just give a sense of our audience there for the panelists and for everybody who's attending today. Another second or two. Thanks for responding to this. We'll close it momentarily. Okay, and you can see here 86% white, 6% for both Black or African American and Asian, 1% American Indian or Alaska Native, and we don't have any Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jason, who's going to host our discussion today, and we'll have all of our panelists' webcams on during this portion. So welcome to Jason and everybody.
And thank you. While I get my screen set up here, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Michael. I want to make sure you're seeing the slide presentation. Do you have my right screen by chance?
Yes.
Okay, so you should see what is justice. All right, so my name is Jason Beske. Thank you for attending. It appears my head is not as big as it was on the cover slide, so I do fit in a square here. So today we're going to have a very important discussion with David and Eric. Thank you for joining me. And I'm going to talk through a series of questions with them and really leave today as really conversation. We're going to present, we do have some slides, we'll present some data, but I think today's discussion will really be around some of the anecdotes we've experienced as professionals in the field of planning. So I want to keep it very much as a conversation. So I do encourage attendees to submit questions. We have a lot of attendees. So we won't be able to get to them all, but hopefully we can categorize them and continue the conversation as much as possible when we're finished with our presentation portion. As I mentioned, we have a series of questions, 5 key questions ranging from what is justice all the way to economic opportunity. I do want to start, and I want to jump into the conversation pretty quick here so we can take advantage of the time. But as a professional planner, I think it's important, and I'm going to read from the AICP Code of Ethics, which I think, you know, as a white male, I feel like I'm very much in a position of listening and learning at this point. And I feel like I do really have a guidepost through our ethical obligation as planners. I know many of you are probably AICP certified planners, but I just wanted to read this one principle, which has stuck with me ever since I took my test over 15 years ago. And it says, we shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and to promote racial and economic integration. We shall urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions that oppose such needs. So I think this is very important. It's an important reminder for those of you who have taken the exam or those of you who will take the exam, but also for those who may never take the exam but are looking for that guidepost as we work through these very difficult times. So with that, I'm going to start the conversation. And Eric, why don't I start with you? And if you want to just speak a little bit and perhaps talk about what is justice to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Let me just kind of set the context in terms of how I'm going to talk about justice. So I'm going to say this not necessarily just in the social context of what's happening right now in the country, but I really see justice as, living in an environment in our communities, basically, which supports both social and economic opportunity for all. It means that we have an operating environment in our cities that have basically removed barriers of the past that prevents, those that are on the margins from really pursuing their economic and social opportunity. So in a sort of purest sense, I would say it's like being in the community and there's like no barriers to you, both from a policy perspective where you are free to pursue your social and economic opportunity. So for me, that's really what it means in its purest sense, that those barriers are really not there, that you are living in an environment where you are born, you grow up, and you have that freedom to pursue opportunity. That's what I think justice is.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up to that, Eric, then. I know you have a varied experience and background, some very important positions across the country. Have you seen personally more opportunity for justice in, whether this is in the city or in suburbs, different parts of the country, or are you seeing similar experiences throughout?
I'm seeing similar experiences throughout. I've worked in the South, the North, the East. I've been pretty much all over the country, and I see the similarities across the board. So, I think that the opportunity to strip away a lot of those barriers exists in communities all over the country. Suburban communities that I was talking to David, we were talking about this earlier. This is not our grandfather's suburbs anymore. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But truthfully, it's sort of the same across the country. It's sort of like it doesn't matter where you go. I've been in the Twin Cities recently, and the same situation exists there as well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, Eric. David, do you want to go run through a few slides and then we can keep the conversation going?
Sure. I won't surprise you and say no. Yes. Being very old, older than most of you in this audience, when I was growing up, this is what the world looked like to me. People were white. They lived in families. There were two people who worked very hard, but only one of them got paid. And you just didn't bring up tough issues and talk about them. Next, please. Today and for the next 2 decades, our demographics are changing so rapidly that we already live in a world nothing like that, but boy, are we moving further and further from that. So for the next 20 years, 80+% of all net new households are going to be singles and couples. We are going to live in a majority of color society probably within the next decade. And all kinds of families can raise kids these days. Next, please. I'm going to quickly say these changes have profound implications for suburbs. We tend to focus on all the change going on in cities. In fact, suburbs will probably change even faster. But let me shift now directly to justice and equity. I had the pleasure and the real honor of being asked to lead the post-Katrina master plan for New Orleans, and to be a little bit direct and rather blunt. I realized after about a month that we weren't going to get anywhere in rebuilding, and particularly building, not just rebuilding, but building better this wonderful city, if we didn't directly get a lot of conversations about race and justice going quickly. Good friend and colleague, I'll give him credit, Bill Gilchrist, who was then the planning director for Birmingham, Alabama, came and led a series of workshops with folks, just in neighborhood after neighborhood, to get folks talking about race and the issues that they perceive, so that the Black community and the white community came together, were on the same page about recovery. And the lesson I learned here is for communities to move forward, particularly in rapidly changing times, and Hurricane Katrina certainly created one, they have to be able to come together as one community, and that means getting past deeply ingrained racial justice and equity issues. Coming back to something that Eric just said, he reminded me, we had some workshops with the Planning Commission about what does equity mean? This was after somebody in the audience said, stop sounding like communists. One member of the conversation said, well, equity to me sounds, I have to work hard and you get to take some of what I earn. And the response was, no, that's not at all what it means. It means something, this comes right back to what Eric said, it means giving everybody an equal playing field. So why is this issue so important to suburbs going forward? Next, please, Jason. Because suburbs are anything but homogeneous. And I think the veneer really got pulled away after the crash of 2008, and we began to really see the changes going on in suburbs, including rapidly growing poverty. Next, please. I'm going to go through these quickly, ask questions if you want. This is driven by dramatic demographic changes. So let me just say, in the Ozzie and Harriet days, the households that bought houses had lots of kids. They shaped suburban America as we know it. Today, going forward again for 20 years, 80+% of net new households, that is our housing market, our singles and couples. Their preferences are far more urban. Today, 60+% of our housing supply is single family detached. 80+% of our demand is looking for different housing. They're looking for new urban centers and suburbs, and they're pushing prices up in cities and pushing folks out because there isn't enough housing supply in cities to meet their needs and aspirations. Next, please. So not only that, but households who prefer urban living tend to be wealthier on average, whiter, and more educated. So what has happened? Poverty in suburbs is up. This was 2015 data. Today, it would probably be closer to 70%, the number of folks living in poverty in suburbs, compared to much smaller increases in cities and rural places. Poverty has come home to suburbs. And this is in part, there are two messages here. One reason that gentrification is happening is because, frankly, white folks have more than 10 times median household wealth than our African-American peers. And so when we move into a place, we push up prices and others get pushed out. Next, please. And just to make this more complicated so we can make it simpler later, every city, region in America is trying to create more high growth, high value jobs with a real future. Those are in the knowledge industry. The folks who attract knowledge industry jobs and investment are folks with education. They're folks with higher incomes. So you can look here and see the bigger the red circle, the more successful those cities and regions are in promoting economic growth. Next slide. These are the same regions where folks with lower incomes, primarily of color, but not all color, are being pushed rapidly into suburbs. I mean, there are areas where in 10 years, the number of folks in poverty got by 100%, let alone the average of 75%. But to make matters more challenging, let's go. They're not being pushed into every part of a suburb. Next, please, Jason. What we used to think of as an urban issue, concentrated poverty, is reproducing itself very rapidly and to a greater extent in suburbs. So not only are lower income folks being pushed into suburbs, but they're being pushed into areas of suburbs where prices are dropping into concentrated poverty that's probably even more concentrated than the urban poverty they knew. Next, please. And what has happened, if you look in central cities at neighborhoods that are changing, I won't, this slide, the numbers here are slightly complicated. Basically, change in cities in a neighborhood means gentrification. Change in suburbs means a concentrating poverty, and that's based on who's moving in and who's moving out. Next, please. So this is a face of suburbia that many of us don't see, but is rapidly increasing. I'm gonna invite Eric to make some more comments in a minute, but I just want to note that if you look at the institutions, the government agencies at a city level, the funding from nonprofits to help folks who are in greater need because they live in poverty, they are all still in urban cores. Suburbs in terms of giving people access to jobs, school, education, each other, healthcare, education, the things that are so much more in need are available to a much lesser extent in suburbs. And Eric, I'll turn the floor back to you because I know I had a chance to work with you in Bloomington, and you're the one we're trying to solve these problems for that suburb. But I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, to that point, I think what we're really facing in suburban communities, is the sort of context of, I'm gonna use the word community development, is not necessarily ingrained in suburban communities like it would be necessarily in urban communities. So the functions, if you really look at governments in the suburbs, some of them they are not really built to sort of deal with and address these issues. So for example, in Bloomington, we look at the structure of Bloomington, which is a pretty prolific suburb outside of Minneapolis. The structure of community development is really about reviewing plans, processing development applications. It's not about looking at the collective connections between growing poverty, racial issues, zoning issues that have really sort of hampered sort of an inclusive community. So what I mean by that, when you start to go there, you see almost like just a traditional function of planning and not so much with community development. So for example, the aging population in the suburbs, the shelter and poverty issues in the suburbs, those have been sort of rooted in like pure community development, not necessarily so much in planning. So I think a lot of that has to start to, more community development thinking has to start to sort of creep into suburban planning and thinking to address some of these issues.
And before we move on, I'll just add, from a conversation we had earlier, I thought that was very poignant of you, Eric, and I see that myself. I think community development is great, but I think it comes down to what are the policies that are guiding us, and is it more about, should it be more about capacity building and helping people to, lifting everybody up. All right, so with that, I'm going to move forward here, keep us going. And our next question, and David, I'm going to have you start on this one. And Eric, I know you have a wealth of experience also. So David, did you want to run through a few slides here?
Sure.
So
and I just say Eric is in Dallas's COVID response.
Yes, exactly.
Excuse me?
If you can't see the screen, the question is, what has COVID-19 taught us about how we can create a more just future?
Okay, thank you. All right. And I say, I believe that Eric is in charge of Dallas's COVID response, so he'll have a lot to say. I want to just make a couple of comments, primarily about the extent that COVID is or is not going to change the trajectory that I was talking about a few minutes ago and the challenge of suburbs. And the answer quickly is not. There's been a whole number of sort of memes out there, particularly in social media, that says that people are fleeing density. In fact, there's a whole lot of research that says that that is not the case, that housing demand in urban cores is not changing, that when you have a market where 80+% of net new households, that's the housing market, don't have kids, that is not how you build suburban single family neighborhoods. That is how you build, that's urban demand and new emerging urban centers in suburbs. So COVID has not changed that trajectory. Next, please. Which means it has not changed the issues we're talking about for suburbs. And I found this was Johns Hopkins did a fascinating study, basically, which we'll talk more about, that essentially said that COVID does not correlate with density. It correlates with poverty, crowding, and race. This is a reminder from Hopkins that says that those of us who are planners, and a lot of you are in the public sector, and I'm going to guess many of you are have planning responsibilities, basically our charge will be to continue to create denser walkable places that encourage people to walk and are much healthier. The same truths that were evident before COVID will be evident after, as we plan for our future. Next, please. Just to sort of reinforce this, the data has actually grown stronger in recent years. This is from Joe Courtwright, in terms of the fact that the more educated we are and the younger, more educated they are, the more we are moving into urban cores, again, pushing prices up in core cities, displacing folks, but also creating a very different future for suburbs, which is about housing these same folks in urban, higher density, mixed use neighborhoods, a whole new generation of suburban neighborhoods where we have the opportunity as we come out of COVID to create mixed income, diverse communities that were much tougher to do when we lived in a land of single family detached subdivisions. Yes, next please. And as I mentioned, one of the real messages from the Hopkins study is just how COVID has been one more really clear indication, far more than one more. It has cast a really harsh light on the inequities in our society, because it is those who were already facing the kinds of challenges that Eric's talked about who have suffered to a much greater extent. This is incidences of COVID for Los Angeles County, where I grew up. And believe me, the darker the red, the poorer the census tract. Thanks. So, again, you're there. Launch in.
Did you have any of the last thoughts, David, before Eric? Okay.
No, I think let's hear from Eric. And yeah.
Well, first of all, let me just, can you guys hear me? Let me make sure I'm on there. Okay, you can hear me, right? Okay. So first of all, I'm just going to say this is unprecedented territory in terms of what we are dealing with. So I see sort of this W curve. We're going to be up, we're going to be down, we're going to be up, we're going to be down. But I think the most eye-popping thing that has really emerged is that this is an opportunity to do some resetting on policy. Because I don't know, I doubt very seriously if we're going to go back to the way things were before. And what I mean by that is in the suburbs here in Dallas, just like in the city, also in the suburbs, this pressing need for rental assistance, mortgage assistance is a serious problem. Also, the need for small business support to try to keep the doors open is actually causing some serious concerns throughout the suburban areas in North Texas. But I think the most important and pressing thing related to COVID is going to be how do we really start to reposition the suburbs in terms of development that is connecting the dots along transportation, that is creating both density, both opportunity for access to greater opportunity. And this is something that you know, is going to be a significant challenge, because what we're seeing across the North Texas region is this constant sort of pressure to provide more and more resources, and the resources are just not there. And I know they are not there in the suburbs, because we have weekly discussions with a series of coalition of cities in the region talking about these issues. So do I have the answer? No, but I think the future is an opportunity to start looking at connecting the dots along some of the opportunities to create more inclusive communities.
Well, so Eric, in the vein of addressing policies, I know you landed in Dallas at a very difficult time, you know, and then taking on this the COVID issue right away. I know Dallas will be going through a comprehensive plan update very shortly. So I'm wondering that is that an opportunity then to start addressing some of these inequities and in light of the policies you'll be creating?
Absolutely, with a heavy focus on TOD planning, heavy focus on connectivity of the transportation networks, in particular heading to the outer areas around Dallas. How do we utilize vacant, underutilized land? All of the above will be a part of the comprehensive plan.
And I would assume a year from now we would have a much different conversation once planners and communities start to address the issue in the policy. So it'll be interesting to have a follow-up to see where things land after all of this.
Yeah, you know, and let me just say this. One, to me, I'll just tell you one indicator where I think, in particular, from a justice equity perspective, I think city planning departments all across the country, in tandem with city councils and city administrations, should be looking at any and all zoning that are sort of reflective of the past and the barriers that they have created in terms of fostering access to both opportunity and the creation of quality housing. To me, that's a great, strong message that any community in the suburbs or wherever could send to its community, that we have stripped all these pieces away. We've gone through our development codes, zoning, everything, and we took all of this stuff out, you know, and I think that's a powerful message communities could really, really send. And truthfully, some people don't even know they exist, you know, so it can be an exercise of learning for a lot of communities.
Yep, absolutely. David, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Eric said, and you sort of alluded to it too. If you, and it's, I hadn't thought it would land in the COVID part of the COVID message, but it really does. So we do have a dramatic opportunity, as Eric said, to do things differently coming forward. For suburbs, if you look at the market, it is going to be for very different kinds of neighborhoods than currently exist. Suburbs are going to need to develop a whole new generation of dense, walkable, mixed use, and this creates opportunity to create mixed income and diverse places that don't exist. There's a whole lot of fresh starting that's going to be happening in suburbs, or is beginning to happen. It's already begun to happen, as we talked about in Suburban Remix. I was just thinking, we worked with Eric in Bloomington, you know, older, mature suburb of Minneapolis, not particularly growing fast, but all the growth is for a new generation of places in Bloomington that don't exist. It's a chance for a new start. Jason, you and I are working in Leesburg, Virginia. Again, all the demand coming forward is to actually redevelop older industrial parks, shopping centers, et cetera, in Leesburg into a new generation of walkable suburban neighborhoods. Boy, do we have a chance to get these right in a way that we, I'll just say, weren't conscious of for the last round when we planned our suburbs. Is that fair?
Let me add something to that. Coming out of COVID, I'm going to use the economic losses. So cities, suburban cities, whatever, they are taking economic losses from sales taxes, fees, everything. So logic would say, coming out of COVID, there should be strategies around these types of developments that will be about place, that will draw investment, that will help cities recapture the losses from COVID. I don't know if a lot of places are thinking about it that way, but I think it's a good way to think about it. So when the objection comes to why should we be doing this, it's going to take us a while to climb out of this mixed use, dense, TOD, suburban retrofits that can actually start to draw people, will also help the economy in these suburbs recover much faster.
So two quick comments. One, we do, Jason and I do a lot of this work, and one of the things I've observed is if you take a shopping mall that has a density, let's say, of let's say it has 200,000 square feet on it, and those square feet have not been doing very well in recent years because of what's happening to malls. You replace that 200,000 square feet with, let's say, 800,000 square feet of mixed-use walkable development with cool retail, et cetera. You have 4 times as many square feet, and each of those square feet is worth probably 4 to 10 times as much as that dying shopping mall square footage was worth. So you basically, many of the sites we've looked at, when you go in and really redevelop them, some of the things we were talking about at Bloomington, you increase this assessed value of a factor of 10 or more. Maybe to me more interesting, we've been working with lots of retail consultants who have been pointing out, and I think this is really fascinating, there's a very tragic dimension to this. A lot of retail businesses will not survive what's happening with COVID. However, because urban demand will still be there, walkable demand is the future of retail, there will be a whole new generation, a whole new opportunity for a new generation of entrepreneurs that we can help come in to rebuild this retail market as older businesses have not been able to make it. And I know this is very sad and I feel almost heartless to talk about this, but we need to see the opportunity side also. And it's a chance to bring a whole new community into the business community to fulfill their dreams of the cool coffee place or to sell the clothes they've been designing.
Let me just add this last point, David. I'm gonna say it this way. But David, I didn't move to the suburbs for that. I moved to the suburbs to have these large tracts of land and to be away from everyone. And I think the COVID response, you're gonna have to carry a larger burden of the responsibility given the economic hits. We have no idea when this is going to slow down, whatever the case is going to be. So I think the question is going to be, how do you sell this to communities,
Okay.
you know, to really start to think more sort of creative about this? We're not trying to take away your suburban lifestyle. We're trying to say you need to have the best of multiple worlds going on. If for no reason at all, you won't be carrying this sort of economic burden solo, because unless you're living under the rock, federal government is not coming to save our cities. There's not a huge source of resources out there that's going to be brought to bear on this. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, I think that is a great point, and we have been in the business of addressing it. So it starts with the fact that the newer mixed-use, walkable, higher density, much higher value neighborhoods that will really rescue a lot of communities from a fiscal standpoint happen without changing a blade of grass on anybody's front lawn. Second, what they do change is the, how should I say it, the resale value of that house. If you look across suburbia, it is single family houses within walking distance of a main street, of a place that creates community, of a cool place to get coffee. Those have held their value much more strongly. And I think given demographics and the housing market going for 20 years, it is suburbs that, without changing, again, anything about the neighborhoods that folks moved into and love, but to give them a whole new kind of amenity. And I think you were sort of driving at this, and I'm saying the obvious here, but thank you.
Yep, and you took the blade of grass right out of my mouth, so thank you. And I do want to throw out one rule of thumb that David and I like to use a lot, and that's if you can, and this goes to the town center concept in the suburbs, if you can develop 1,000 to 2,000 units of residential housing, and that depends on the income and the what people actually, the buying power people have. You can support one block of Main Street retail. And I would say in this atmosphere and moving forward, it's going to be much more desirable to walk down a Main Street and access a store versus going into a mall and doing the same.
Just to add, that has to be within a 5-minute walk of that Main Street.
Thank you for throwing that in. Okay, let me move forward. We got to keep going here with the next question, but we're going to, let's see. So this is going to be a poll. Michael, do you want to go ahead and introduce the poll?
Yes. So we just put it up here. It's a very simple question of where do you live? City, suburban, or rural? And I will mention while you all are responding, I'll tell the panelists that the questions are coming in quite heavy today. So once we have lots of discussion points there too.
Okay, we'll continue to try to move through this here pretty quick.
Okay, and we'll close this momentarily. Interesting split today. We'll see in a moment. And again, if you're having trouble on the screen, make sure that the full screen is off. Okay, and we'll close it momentarily here. And so here we have 50% suburban, 41 city, and 8% rural.
Okay, let's see here. Okay, we're back to the screens. Okay, so we're going to start our next question here. David, I think I'll go ahead and have you start this one off as well. You have a few slides and some data, and then Eric, I'll follow up with you on this question. So David, what is successful mixed income housing?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm going to say it's housing that works in the marketplace. We work with some terrific housing analysts who spend a lot of time in focus groups with folks. And probably in the last decade, diversity has actually across the market, and I'm talking about economic and racial diversity, become a plus in the marketplace. So this said, I'm going to talk about an urban example where, boy, did we learn a lot of lessons. But the headline is to create successful mixed income housing, which is something we should be focused on very hard. It's about creating a successful mixed income diverse neighborhood. It's the housing alone. That's almost the easy part. Next, please. So this is a development called One Charlestown in Boston. The things we had to think about were, first of all, mixed income housing does not mean buildings with different incomes. It means people with different incomes living in the same building, on the same floor, using the same elevator. And for those who are dubious, just please trust me, it works in the marketplace. It's about mixed income for sale as well as rental. It is about mixing folks of ages and making sure that folks, it's not just about race and income, but age, have access to these communities. It's about making sure that the retail works for everybody. Starbucks is just great for people who can afford an expensive cup of coffee. One thing we discovered in the work on One Charlestown is there are some really great nonprofit fresh food and fresh fruit and vegetable sort of nonprofits that basically their mission is to serve lower income communities to get them fresh food. It turns out Starbucks loves being next to them. You can create, you have to curate, but you need to curate and create a retail environment that invites the full economic spectrum of folks to enjoy the main street you've just created because you have 1,000 to 2,000 housing units. And maybe most important, it's about creating a public realm, and we're going to talk more about this, that actively invites everybody in that community. It is things that everybody like. I did a Parks and Public Realm plan for the city of Miami a number of years ago and learned, and boy, a lot of this was a surprise to me, how people of different cultural backgrounds use parks and public spaces very differently. If you want them all in the same space, you can't just say, please come. You have to create the things that they want to do. We're going to talk about actually probably the most important piece of this, which is getting people into the workforce, giving them economic opportunity, things that Eric's talked about a little bit later. Eric, did you want to add some thoughts?
Yeah, let me get some thoughts to that. On the issue of mixed income housing, I'm going to use a suburban example because there's this notion out here that you can't do mixed income housing or affordable housing. So in Bloomington, Minnesota, suburban city outside of Minneapolis, we created arguably one of the best affordable housing ordinances in the country. And the way it was done is we went to the development community and asked a question about the barriers. And we crafted an ordinance that focused on regulatory relief first before you got to cash. For example, if you were located in a aging commercial corridor, like one of those areas David talked about, and you're doing a development, you could get up to 40% reduction in parking at $35,000 per stall. You do the math on that on a, say, 100 unit development, 200 parking spaces, a 40% reduction. You know, you can get smaller unit sizes, you can get density bonuses. It is an array of tools that you can use. So when I tell you that we went from having no affordable units in the pipeline, because remember, guys, this is about income. You know, the slide that shows the income doesn't correlate with the cost of housing. So the narrative around affordable housing is skewed so far to the negative that it doesn't really talk about the importance of the connection between the incomes, the employment, and the need for housing. So I think suburban communities should really take the time to look at connecting those dots so that when you make the case regarding the need for mixed income housing, you're really conveying the importance of what your community is going through. In Bloomington, Minnesota, again, for example, the city council didn't have clarity on what affordable housing was. We took them through a whole process and we educated them on the connection between the people living in Bloomington, what they were making, what types of jobs they had, and the need for affordable housing. Once they got that clarity, the ordinance was passed with unanimous support from the development community across the board, and it is a well-tooled document. The moral of the story is, I think you just have to take the time to really do those pieces to understand what the true need is, and align your tools and your strategy, you know, not drawing the line in the sand, but really having both elements, because the senior community is just as important as a younger person moving into the community. So that is really what I would say, because I'm just going to say it this way: developers will tell you, well, we can't do it, which is really not true. I would challenge anybody to look at the research and really study the issue. You can do it. You just have to align the tools and find the aligned developers, because not all developers don't want to do this. We got to find aligned developers. Like we said to the council, all developers are not the same. Some will have different financial metrics. Find the ones that are aligned with your public policy, then watch how quickly you can solve some of these issues.
So Jason and I, since we did Suburban Remix, have often been asked to go out and talk to suburban communities about how to manage change. How do we unlock the opportunities that a new era of urban suburbia offers? How do we have the conversations with communities that Eric mentioned? And the thing we always say is you have to start with leadership. Somebody has to step forward and lead the community discussion. And you just heard a great example of that from Eric.
Absolutely, and I think that gets right back to what I was saying earlier. After what Eric said is the capacity building. But Eric, you mentioned you brought it to the council, and you really had to teach them, and it was a learning opportunity for them. So I think education plays a large role in this. And then you said you came out on the other end with unanimous support. Were there any roadblocks in particular to that, or was it really just staying close to them and helping them to understand what the issues were in the community?
Yeah, it was staying close to the council and educating them, because the notion that you can't do this. So let's take the Twin Cities region. 89% of developments in the Twin Cities were market rate developments with limited affordability over the last 10, 12 years. So the whole context was, well, affordable housing is left to HUD and low-income housing tax credits. And I said to the council, well, you have to say to your citizens, then you have to wait maybe 3 years on average to try to get a tax credit deal done. Or you have to say to your citizens that the HUD has been out of business of cities for a long time. There aren't any resources. So what are you going to say to your citizens? Well, Dr. Johnson, how much is this going to cost us? It's not going to cost us anything, because we're going to align the regulatory relief before cash, before tax increment financing or anything like that. It was an education process, not just with the elected officials, but with the development community. And the resistance was minimal after we laid out the arguments and really put the pieces together. So the challenge is it doesn't apply the same for every community, but there are steps you can take that you can really educate your community on to really understand this issue.
I think it's really important, as you mentioned, to find those developers that are aligned.
Well, and let me just say this too. The examples don't exist in the suburban communities. There are examples of suburban communities all across the country doing this work, but you don't hear about them because we make it more of an urban versus a suburban issue. So the counter has always been, well, we're not the big city. You know, you don't have to be the big city. You know, you could be, you could be Bloomington, you could be St. Louis Park, these cities that are suburban cities actually doing this work.
Yeah, and I think also it takes a brave elected leadership also to be able to have the willingness to say no at times, and really trying to strike that right balance for a community. So, all right, I'm going to move to the next question, if you don't mind. And it's around what David mentioned earlier. It's the creating the public spaces. So how do we create public spaces that everyone calls mine? And David, again, I know you have some slides, so why don't we run through those and have a conversation?
Very quickly, because we want to get to all the great questions.
Yep.
So first of all, I probably already said this, an inclusive public space is one that proactively invites diversity by having the kinds of activities, the kinds of program, the kinds of design that meets the needs and aspirations of very diverse folks. And, you know, let's just keep going here. One of the most obvious is there's nothing better than a play fountain to invite a bunch of kids in to play who don't know that they're different from each other. What is really important is their parents gather around because they got to watch what's happening to their kids, and they start talking to each other. This to me is, if you want an easy in to start. But next, please. This to me is one of the most important. This is Railroad Park in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham is a place where people talk very consciously about race and justice. Once heard a couple of folks at a meeting I was at. I've done a lot of planning in Birmingham, and how should I say this? They were black, I was white, and they were sort of joking with each other about whether somebody had moved into a kind of an upper middle class white neighborhood instead of a black neighborhood. And the fact that they would have that conversation in front of me 10 years ago, it really impressed me. But they created Railroad Park, and I had a chance to help advocate for that, and then to be on a jury that gave it a pretty important award. This is the common ground of a city that with a very significant race and justice and equity history that really honors that history and is conscious of it. And it is fascinating. It is where every neighborhood in Birmingham and the suburbs come to have, regardless of income or race or anything else, their neighborhood potluck dinners. It is the place where kids of every age can find something they want. I loved the slide on my left of that skateboarder, very obviously trying to impress those two young women walking by. Probably no more than 30 feet from that, there are a couple of folks playing chess. There are outdoor libraries. There's everything you could want to say to folks, this is yours because we have consciously tried to reach out to what you want, what you value, what your culture is about, to make this a place that is yours. And then, and finally, we're doing some work in Memphis and the downtown. This is urban, but boy, does it have suburban applications. Does a great job. This gets back to inviting a new era of entrepreneurs. This was pre-COVID, but boy, is it more relevant after COVID. They are really conscious of tapping into the entrepreneurship, the very diverse entrepreneurship and ideas that come from a very diverse community, and trying to give them all a voice in terms of the ability to open the business that they've dreamed of and try it out. And they do this in ways that are very cost effective. You know, they don't charge anybody rent for the first 6 months or 9 months. They give folks a chance to start. They give them the training. And this, probably more than anything I've said, creates a kind of a public realm along streets that lots of people call mine. Eric, you're welcome to comment.
No, I'm not going to add too much to that. I just think that, again, the spaces, should be and need to be inclusive in terms of different types of uses in spaces that represent the community. That's all I would add to that.
Okay, and I would say that from my perspective, in working with in the suburbs, we absolutely use precedent examples from urban settings, and I think even these examples from Birmingham, Memphis, they are applicable to the suburbs and the lessons we've learned. I think when in a public space is really only authentic in my mind when everybody is involved in planning for it and programming that space. So something to keep in mind. Okay, I am going to move to our last question, and looks like we have a lot of questions teed up And so why don't we start with how do we make a meaningful difference toward expanding economic opportunity?
Okay, so let me just say, do this again quickly. It's not about creating jobs. We got plenty of jobs in this country. Starting around 1980, incomes stopped tracking economic progress. As our economy has gotten more productive, become more productive, the rewards in terms of incomes have largely gone to the top 20, particularly the top 10% of us. There is no longer a basic equity, go out, work hard, get a job, and you'll do well. Remember planning for neighborhood New Orleans, where 80% of the folks had jobs and 50% of them were living in poverty. Jobs were not the answer. Next, please. And this just basically tells us that more than 40% of all US workers are basically earning, are just above the poverty line in terms of the jobs that they have, many of them with families, and it's a challenge we have to address as a society if we're going to move forward together. But let's talk about how. So Eric has brought up a number of times, and I sort of slipped and addressed this earlier, you know, where do the dollars come from? And I want to emphasize that the economic, the next 2 decades with very strong urban demand are a tremendous opportunity for suburbs, because those parts of the suburbs that aren't working, the failing malls, the failing strip retail, the older industrial, the office parks that are no longer competitive, represent an opportunity to create, I'm going to be a little crass here, much higher value development, which can be mixed use, walkable, and can be mixed income, and have many of the things built into the planning and the creation that we've talked about. This is a tremendous opportunity for suburbs, not only to thrive, to become more equitable. And I just want to emphasize, this is a shopping mall outside of Boston. We're busy redeveloping as the big box stores decline. Next, please. This center needs less and less of its parking. So the parking is rolled back. A new urban mixed use, mixed income urban neighborhood is rolling in. I got to tell you, this neighborhood is producing more tax revenue than that retail has for at least the last decade, and in turn can then support, and next slide please, the kinds of active programs that can make a difference. And I want to start with the sort of the third box down, funding job training. That's important. It's workforce readiness. It's giving help to a single mother who's got kids to watch, and you can offer her all the educational opportunities in the world and great jobs. If her first responsibility is taking care of that kid, she can't go out and get that training and get that job. If somebody's made some mistakes in life and has a jail record, as a prison record, in most parts of our country, they are excluded from getting a job for the rest of their natural lives. We've got to be able to cure that. They fix their lives, they can't get a job. So it is getting people ready for the workforce, giving them accessibility to the workforce, and then the training that they need. This is a project in a suburban part of Charlotte, where these things are built in. And this is actually the nature of, as Eric pointed, this is a mission-based developer doing this development. So this company is building this thinking into this development. It's a little easier than it might be in other places. But boy, the dollars are there to make it happen. Also, we're building in a very large minority business participation program, so that, and I think this really does matter, so that folks in the business community who are not in the sort of mainstream, largely white Charlotte development community have access to participate in this project. There's an entrepreneurship institute to teach folks how to start businesses, how to live their dream, and then support to get these small retailers going. And one thing I want to note, and this is going to sound very crass, you got a lot more rent upstairs in the market rate apartments you've created in a mixed income development. And if you've got cool things happening on the ground, you can get very low retail rents and boy, earn that difference upstairs if you've got cool, new, lively stuff happening that represents sort of the living culture of the community that you're appealing to. So there are things that we can really do, and this new generation of neighborhoods is going to make a difference. Suburban neighborhoods. And last slide, I just to drive this home, this was doing planning again in New Orleans with a neighborhood where most of the folks actually had a high school degree or less. They had access to about 1/3 of the jobs in New Orleans, and frankly, there were many more of them than there were jobs. Just 2 more years of technical training, of junior college, basically would have given them access to 85% of the jobs in New Orleans. And frankly, that with those 2 more years, there are more jobs than there are them. The jobs are looking for them. If we can get the barriers out of the way, we can do the things that Eric talked about, but we got to be real about what those barriers are and how to remove them. Eric.
Yeah, I think it really goes down. I think the question is, what can we do? I think it's really about being intentional in your strategies. You know, for example, on the business recruitment side, suburbs are in most cases they have more land or some repositioning of existing properties. So just being intentional in terms of let's say you bring in a company to town, but the jobs that are being created, I'm going to use it's a biotech company moving to the suburbs. They're building health kits or something. And you have these high level jobs, but at the same time, how do you have conversations about, sort of the mid-range and sort of the jobs that would match the population in your town? So I think it's really being intentional, in particular when you're providing support to do that. The same thing on housing. A city could be very creative and take control of the pre-development process and really determine what they want and go out and find what I'm calling aligned partners to help do the work. Because I think everyone on this call pretty much know development is about profit maximizing your asset. So I'm going to go after higher rents. That's what I want. But if you're going to take that approach, you won't ever be able to reach where we really need to reach. So it's about really just being intentional in the strategies and really aligning your resources, there. You don't have to do it in every case, but at least in some cases, because you're sending a message to the community that we are listening, we do care. I'm gonna sort of say this. It's like, I used this early in our discussion, it's like going to war. Every community is in this battle for social and economic prosperity. So, but we're leaving thousands of our soldiers on the sidelines saying, hey, we don't need you guys to help us win this war. But because you're not incorporating them, they are dragging it down even further. And the likelihood that you're going to win that war is very, very slim. To me, it's well known when you focus on high level jobs, you're actually furthering the inequality in communities if you're not having sort of that balance. So I think at the end of the day, it's really about being intentional with the strategies.
Excellent. That's a great point. And I think, why don't we use that as a point to end the formal discussion on? And we're going to run one more poll question, and then we will jump into the Q&A. Michael, if you want to cue that up.
Okay, so it is up on the screen now. And that is your community taking active steps to address justice and equity? And it's a yes or no question.
It's a rather open-ended question, but do your best.
We'll give everybody about a minute to respond here. Thanks to everybody who is responding. If you are having an issue, you might need to close the full screen option. Okay. Just give you a couple seconds more to respond and we'll close it.
And then
breakdown.
Michael, one slide after this and we'll jump off from the Q&A. How about?
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, interestingly, it's 2/3, 1/3 split here. So.
Okay. Well, it would be great at some point to dig into what communities are doing and compiling that as a resource. I know APA has a big social inequity um, perspective right now in trying to address a lot of issues. So I'm going to end with just one slide before the Q&A, and then this is just a soft recommendation. If you would like additional resource, this is Suburban Remix that David and I had edited, and it has a lot of good anecdotes and case studies in it, and you can get a discount now through Island Press if you want to use that code webinar at islandpress.org. So thank you for that, and look forward to fielding questions.
Thanks everybody for giving us a whole bunch of questions. I'll say it's very heavy load of questions. So we'll go till 2:30 or so to answer as many as we can. And I will say we did get a comment about the last question. I wish there was an in-between answer to yes or no.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Very good point.
Interestingly enough. Okay, so just to start, there's so many places we could start, but I'll begin with this one. COVID has become another arsenal for the NIMBYs to push back on TOD and smart growth and to continue to promote suburban sprawl. How do we counter this?
I can jump in where fools rush in or something. Eric, do you want to take a?
Take it first. I'll come behind you.
Okay, so first of all, I think it's very important for those NIMBYs and everybody else to realize that the fundamentals, the demographic foundation for our housing market, folks without kids do not go out and buy single family detached houses well, let's say in nearly the number folks with kids do, I'll put it that way. And they represent a much greater share of our growth, or will, for 20 straight years. That is the fundamental foundation for TOD, for a new generation of walkable urban mixed use, high amenity, mixed income suburban neighborhoods, for the continued gentrification of urban neighborhoods. And there is, one of the lessons that COVID has taught us is and teaching us daily, is to really pay attention to the data, maybe even more than our emotional response right off the bat. And the data says that even at the height of this pandemic, the fundamentals are still at work in terms of where people want to live. Zillow searches are still just as predominantly urban compared to suburban as they were before COVID started. And on this note, Eric or Jason. But Eric.
Yeah, I would probably say to the NIMBY piece, going back to my earlier comment, this is not the suburbs of the past. And I think it would be a fatal mistake if the focus is going to be strictly on single family development, because I think they'll find themselves being in a situation of being less competitive well into the future. This is a sort of blip on the screen. Then the economic spending associated with TOD development far outpace spending around TOD. So I think the argument back to the NIMBYs who would say focus on single family development are really missing sort of the long term. This is a marathon, this is not a sprint, really missing the long term piece here. So that's really what I would say to that.
I would follow up on David, your point about following the data is, we know that housing that has a higher density of people living in the housing, and housing that has workers who are in the service sector are seeing higher incidences of COVID, and coincidentally that tracks with minority populations. So I think the data is pretty clear, and to your point, David, I think the trends are clear as well.
And let me just say this, what's interesting about this whole initial conversation started out about the scare of density and everyone's going to run to the suburbs. And, if you really look at what's happening in Texas, Texas is not a highly dense state. The spread of COVID has nothing to do with the collection of density. It has to do with some other factors I really won't get into. So I think that, to David's point, this is a blip, and I think continuing into the future, it will be about greater density, greater placemaking, greater proximity. I think that is the future.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So actually, a follow-up question on that point. So then how do you sell the increased density to people who move to suburbs for low density?
I can jump in again. So this is a topic that Jason and I talked to lots of folks about in the planning we're doing. And I want to say a discussion that was really difficult 10 years ago largely isn't today. In fact, increasingly, when folks hear the word density, they don't think crowding, they think amenity these days. It is, and I'll come, right back to in the spirit of enlightened self-interest. If you look at housing value going forward, if you look at what single family detached suburban subdivision neighborhoods are remaining relatively more competitive than others in a very changed market, it is those with beautifully manicured lawns and wonderful landscaping and wonderful houses that are within walking distance of places where people can get together, stroll on a main street, run into each other. Well, will again. Places that had the density to promote community and amenity. And I worry I'm repeating myself, but there's also a growing list of suburbs where folks like this can, we can be introduced to folks who live in those suburbs to find out what the experience has been like to have their subdivision is in the same condition it's always been. It's a wonderful place to live, but they have a whole new world available to them. Eric, Jason?
I'll add something else. And I want to say that, density is obviously the discussion we have a lot, and oftentimes it's a pejorative term. I like to try to reframe it a little bit to creating complete neighborhoods. And it gets around, what does having a certain amount of households and people in proximity to an area, what kind of amenity does that offer up? And I think when you can talk about it as a complete neighborhood versus density, it's a much easier conversation.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think too, it's all about comparables as well, and showing examples to those who would say, I moved here just for the low density. It may be fine at that point in time. Edina, Minnesota, which is a very, very rich suburb, which is technically across the interstate from Bloomington. Bloomington held to its suburban, low dense city for years. Bloomington is finding itself in a different place than Edina, which has sort of didn't take the mutually exclusive position that we only need to have single family. They sort of created this context where you can have the best of both worlds, and it's not going to destroy your community. So I think it's probably it's trying to find that balance in the middle to communicate that it does not have to be mutually exclusive.
And one little critical piece of information probably none of us have quite conveyed yet is that it's in 99.9% of the suburbs in America today, you can't afford to build buildings probably taller than 5 floors with some great shops on the first floor, maybe some offices or some retail on the second floor, maybe some housing and a couple floors of housing. This is a density, this is a height and massing sufficient to bring these main streets to life that Jason mentioned. But in these days, it's, I don't think, largely viewed as threatening to a neighborhood a block or two away, frankly.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Next one here. Go ahead. Okay, so you mentioned earlier, and this came in about 2 o'clock, that the existing single-family housing wouldn't need to experience change in suburbs. However, there is a growing movement through the missing middle housing to incorporate ADUs, duplexes, triplexes within these neighborhoods. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, let me talk about that because in Bloomington, which is a predominantly single-family community, we use the concept of testing pilots. So there was an opportunity on city-owned land where we had a developer that was pitching the inclusion of ADUs as future build-out as part of a new single-family mix that they were creating. So we also made some changes in the city's development code to allow for ADUs and provided a incentive base for existing single-family owners for elderly and returning college students to occupy the ADUs. So we really made it incentive-based, and we used some pilot testing along the way to try to convey the importance of ADUs. That is what we did.
And I have to say, in my case, I was probably trying to be overly reassuring by not changing any blades of grass, because in fact, as America changes, first of all, ADUs are probably the most cost-effective and most effective way to introduce diversity in terms of age, occupation, race, and all kinds of things to a neighborhood that we have. Given the fact that a majority of U.S. population growth for the next 20 years is not only going to be in households without kids, it's going to be folks over 65. ADUs are also a terrific way to help folks hold on to the house that they lived in for many years when their income stops going up and they're on a fixed income. It's a great way to provide opportunities for these folks to stay in the same neighborhood should they leave their house, let alone all the other applications that are probably implicit in that question. And we should probably, that this questioner is keeping us a little more honest here. So thank you.
Okay. Next question here. Housing segregation underlies many social issues, notably poverty and opportunity. The New York Times had a provocative op-ed in May about mixing affordable housing into all communities to break the cycle of housing segregation. It is a logical solution, but it seems to require a top-down policy. The community will not be persuaded for this. So how do we take this on?
Yeah, that's been the, David, you can jump in, but that's been the issue going back to the creation of HUD in its early days, dealing with this housing segregation issue. So let me turn to David and I'll come back to that.
Okay, so David would say that, David's going to give a kind of a complex answer. So first of all, inherently, it makes complete sense, and it's really appropriate and right to create a range of opportunities for folks with a range of income to live in every neighborhood. It's a much healthier way to live. It is something that the market supports to a much greater extent than I think many people realize. But I also want to point out that one of the toughest things that can happen to a low-income family is to be pushed out of an environment where they have access to public transportation into one where they depend on owning and operating a car. It costs about $11,000 to $12,000 a year to own and operate a car in the U.S. today. If your household income is $35,000 or $40,000 and two of you are trying to work, you can't do it. In a city, in an more urban environment, you have you have many more mobility options, and you have also much more access to each other. So we have to really think in a kind of a nuanced way. I feel like I just came across like a NIMBY explaining why not to put this unit next to me. And I want to leave this by saying that there are a wide range of people who have housing needs and different incomes, and there is always going to be a reason why somebody could really benefit, including the neighbors, from introducing mixed income housing into single family neighborhoods. I also want to point out that as markets change and there is less demand for particularly larger single family houses, there's going to be a lot more interest in having students or others live there too if somebody wants to buy the house. So Eric, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to my use of the word being intentional. And I can speak to real examples where we have in the past in different positions I've been in where we were really intentional about making sure that we secure affordability throughout some of our most higher income units when we're doing development projects. It could be 5%, it could be 2%, or whatever. We always included the affordable unit in there some kind of way. So I think you have to be intentional. Number two, I would say that we have to look at different strategies that are not reliant on pure market rate developers to build the type of housing that we need. I can give a whole dissertation lecture on that one, but I think it has to be somewhat intentional. No different than what we did in Bloomington. These houses were selling for, I don't know, 500,000 or so. We sort of created an opportunity where 4 of those were going to be affordable at 80% of area median income. We bought down the land for those portions of the project. Developer that we partnered with, oh, hey, that's fine, it's good. Community were sort of up in arms around us, but when we showed them exactly what we're talking about, they screamed and they went away because they found out it wasn't what they thought it was. So I think it's just about just being intentional.
I think a couple points I'd make. I think it's interesting, and actually in Bloomington, some of the single family homes we're finding that are a lot of less valuation are some of the affordable housing that people may want someday, close to a future walkable mixed use corridor. But I think it's going to be really interesting moving forward as more and more cities like Minneapolis have gone forward with eliminating single family zoning. And, you know, how's that equation going to change over time? And I think you will start to see a lot more intentional integration, to Eric's point. So.
Okay. And the question here, what tactical specific examples, models, partnerships, policies, and practices can we point to that truly result in a notable amount of affordable and mixed income areas?
Therein lies the challenge. Let me describe it this way. One side of the, can you see my hand? So on one side of the spectrum, there is market rate developers that we say, please give us some affordable housing as part of what you do. On the other spectrum is low-income housing tax credits, where that is targeting 60% of area median income. 2.5, 3 years to get it done. Those are basically the 2 spectrums we have, and in public housing. There's not much more outside of that. You have community development corporations, nonprofits doing some housing sort of in between. I say that to say that this is now, in my opinion, an opportunity to start to look at some new ways of doing this. What I tend to see is the city, whether it's suburban city, urban city, whatever, in particular on its land and in acquisitions, they can totally set a different perspective on affordable housing if it's designed around what I'm calling a shared value sort of model. So are there examples of truly disruptive examples? I would say no. Are there a need for some? Yes. Are there some new models? I would say yes. Too much time. It would take too much time to get into it in this discussion. So anyone can reach out to me. We could talk about it some more. But, you know, so I'll give you an example. We are using a public facilities corporation model, which basically there is no taxes associated with that. And under a sort of more social enterprise model, we believe we can produce units that the private market can't produce, and different than low-income housing tax credit projects, again, which takes 2.5, 3 years on average to get done. So I would say there's not really a whole bunch of innovation out there related to that. Some people would get mad with me because they say, oh yeah, we're doing some innovative stuff, but truth being told, it's not. It's one of those 2 buckets that we're basically operating in. So I'll leave it at that.
So as a quick postscript, unfortunately, I can't give a better set of examples than Eric just did, because there are very few. I want to emphasize that we now have the opportunity to change that, because we are entering a generation where suburban development will be much more urban in terms of the kinds of 5-story buildings we talked about, but mixed use, higher density, walkable, et cetera, and will create the opportunity, but it will take public sector leadership to say, if you want to come and develop in my community, achieve probably 30% affordability with a range, not of income, but 30% of the units is affordable with a range of incomes. That's a ready standard I would urge any community to look at, and then study further, but just as a basic recommendation. Part of this also comes back to the fact that the traditional providers of affordable housing are community development corporations or mission-driven developers who really understand how to make affordability work. They haven't been active in the suburbs. It's going to come back to an urban example again, but it's been very successful. I had the opportunity to do planning for development next to the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. This is a neighborhood that was largely made up of place-based Section 8 housing and has been redeveloped by CDCs, private developers. It's Wineland Park, if you want to look it up. Private developers and market-based developers and developers interested in mixed income housing. And it's probably redeveloped with several thousand units now at about a third, and is a very competitive Columbus neighborhood. Next question, probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, David. There seemed to be a distinction between mission-based developers and traditional developers. Is there a similar distinction between mission-based and traditional capital lenders supporting each type of developer?
Yes, yes, yes. I'll give you an example. The non-traditional should have different debt coverage service ratio, different returns on capital, et cetera. So therein lies the struggle. CDFIs, community development finance institutions, are the ones that's carrying that space. But here is the challenge. You will find that their money is no different than a traditional bank in terms of its debt to income ratios, equity return requirements and everything, because we went through this exact example on a 350 unit complex that we were saving in Bloomington, where the city council put everything they had into it. We ran into a barrier because of the financing from the developer that was using CDFI, and their requirements were no different than the traditional market. To me, that's where part of this conversation needs to go, squarely at the CDFIs, which Congress created to be able to provide the low-cost capital, a different sort of set of financial returns. But in my experience, and I review annually for the Treasury, I'm not finding that that set is treating the financing any differently. Because you can have all of the great plans in the world, but when you get to that side of the equation, you will run into a barrier. So I would say there's not much distinction there in terms of the financial requirements for those that should be providing the lower cost sort of capital.
There are also challenges on the public side for the capital. Tax credits, for example, are often state tax credits, housing tax credits are often structured in such a way that it's very hard to mix incomes within the same building, which then makes it harder to bring in the market rate side of financing and harder to create a real mixed income community, even though the capital is there.
Yep.
Okay,
More.
thanks. Okay, so are you all okay if we go a few minutes over for a couple more questions?
Sure.
We still have 500 people online here. In our area, we have a number of shopping centers and former malls that have gone vacant, but owners are waiting for values to come back, so they're not redeveloping. How can we incentivize them to redevelop without spending lots of public money to benefit private wealthy owners?
One, I would say, and this is a real life example, depending on the zoning, I would change the zoning. That would provide an opportunity to incentivize them to maybe work towards redeveloping their declining strip malls. I think that's one thing you can do to help. But let me turn to David, because I know these guys are sort of the soldiers on the ground dealing with this all the time.
So what are the wounds we have suffered? No. So I think there are a couple things. One, what public sector can do is the public process that builds support. This gets back to a lot of the questions we have about, do I have to live next to density and things like that, that builds the understanding that Eric talked about, builds the community-based political support to change the zoning to higher density, mixed use, walkable redevelopment, which definitely is possible these days and much in demand. In fact, the biggest challenge often that the developers we work with face is finding sites large enough to really create something transformational so they can really create a there when they create a new mixed use, mixed income, walkable, higher density community. Malls are not coming back, and I think everyone on this call probably realizes that the nature of retail has changed so fundamentally, partly because of the internet, partly because since 70% of us don't earn anything more than we did in 1970 in real dollar terms, mass market retailers are competing for sort of a stagnant pie. Walkable retail in urban areas is where the growth is happening, and where you increase housing, that retail increases. That's only happens in a mall if you then create the 1,000 to 2,000 units of housing on that mall. We just, this is worth mentioning. We did some work for a terrific developer, Northland Properties, that owned a site affectionately known as Marshall's Plaza in a fairly affluent suburb of Boston called Newton. I should say a place where a lot of folks feel my life's just fine, my house is just fine, why change? And they are now developing a 1-point-something million square foot mixed use, walkable, higher density, et cetera, redevelopment worth much, much more than Marshall's Plaza was. Some neighbors actually put this project on a citywide referendum as a ballot measure. They called it right size Newton, meaning we shouldn't have these new kinds of places in Newton. And this development was approved by a 2-to-1 margin. It was approved by a 2-to-1 margin because the developer went out and did a really good education process around how many parks there were, what kind of walkable Main Street there was going to be, how many folks could now age in place in Newton by moving here, et cetera. Without that political process, they would not have been able to unlock the value from this site. I hope I'm not wandering away from the question here. The market is in, I actually don't know. You know, Jason should comment. He just did a study for NIOP on reuse of malls.
Yeah, so I recently did a research report called Repurposing Retail. It's about repositioning, redevelopment, different ways that malls and retail centers are repositioning themselves, basically. And unfortunately, to be the Grinch, there are a lot of retailers who won't make it and are unsubsidizable. They're just not going to make it in this new environment. You know, a couple things I found is if they can be job generators for a community is very important. But also if you can, you know, one of the reasons that malls were successful in the first place, you know, experientially, obviously, now I think we crave a different experience, but it was the fact that you were creating this critical mass of retailers in proximity to one another that fed off of each other. So I think it's still going to ring true that you want to create some type of a critical mass, but it's going to have to be that experiential retail that may be part of a new mixed use development. I think one of the questions to consider, and we're doing this as part of our suburban retrofit in Bloomington, is how do we prop up some of the local mom and pop shops to be able to compete with some of the regionals, and so that you get this holistic cross section of retailers that are represent the whole a swath of the community. So there's a number of ways to do it, but I would think don't try to rescue retailers that are unrescuable, but rather start to look at creating environments where retailers who will make it through this can thrive and start to lend themselves to part of that experience overall.
And on the way, while we won't urge you to spend a lot of money up front, even though we're consultants, one, I think, terrific investment is tax increment financing or other public-private partnership dollars that you as a community can invest in creating the sort of armature, the infrastructure of urban, the walkable streets, the public spaces, et cetera, that the private sector probably can't afford to do. We did one of the most project I spent many years on in Dublin, Ohio, very successful suburb just outside of Columbus that was basically attracting most of the Class A office space out of Columbus. That stopped as the world changed and knowledge industries wanted to go back downtown, et cetera. They created a new walkable downtown. It's called Bridge Park, invested about $300 million of suburban town money in a development that attracted about $2 billion then of private capital. That money was very worthwhile. they probably had to spend a few $100,000 to lay the groundwork to be able to do that, to build the public support to unlock the ability to create this downtown.
Yep. And we can go ahead and share the link if you want to that study. It's a pretty quick study with some good takeaways, I think.
Oh, you're saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
I'm sorry, I'm telling you, Michael, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. We'll share that. I guess maybe last question, and then we'll have closing thoughts. So how do you deal with opposition to more housing that clings to minimum parking requirements? Parking also undercuts transit demand.
David?
You're a parking guy, David.
Yeah.
Forget about parking. It's not going to be a problem anymore. No. So first of all, one of the biggest obstacles to redeveloping at a higher density is the need to spend $50,000 per parking space for structured parking versus $1,000 for surface. So boy, do you want to build as little of that parking as possible. There's a whole lot of data out there that if somebody wants to email me, we can get to you, that shows if you have 1,000 units of housing and 500,000 square feet of office, how many spaces can those share? Housing uses the spaces at night, office during the day, and you can probably cut the total parking you would have to build otherwise by 30–40%. Going forward, the landscape is going to be changing very dramatically. Within maybe a little more than a decade, a majority of us, may seem hard to imagine now, are going to drive cars with enough connected technology in them. They won't drive themselves. We'll still be driving them, but they will park themselves. And if any of you saw the Hyundai ad on the Super Bowl, not meaning to plug the Super Bowl, you notice that that car that self-parked parks 6 inches from the car next to it. So rather than need 2 feet of clearance car to car, you needed 6 inches. You can begin to imagine as the majority of cars self-park, how many cars we're going to be able to fit into every existing parking structure and every existing parking lot that we've got today. And that figure is about 25–30%. So you begin to put these together, and over the next decade, this is the present future for development for planning now, we're going to need a lot less expensive structured parking. Then in the next decade, certainly by 2040, we are in the era of autonomous mobility. It will be here. The technology is here today. It's the regulatory and infrastructure side dimensions that really need to catch up. In urban areas, and probably in terms including suburbs close into urban centers, the model will probably be shared autonomous mobility, much less expensive than a shared Uber ride today or Lyft ride, but much higher quality in terms of who it will appeal to, et cetera. These won't park. So long story short, if there were ever a point at which we should try to avoid any investments in parking as we add development, we have entered that era. And I will point out that we, in a couple of, in places like Elkhart, Indiana and Hammond, Indiana, these are not places that have been front and center in terms of where the development market wants to go. These are cities fighting hard to lure really interesting development. We've probably, in those two communities, pulled about $20 million worth of parking out of projects because there's enough parking to use in the interim. And by the time that develops over the next 10 years, those spaces won't be needed. I hope this is making sense. And finally, last nail in the coffin, so to speak, people talk about, well, let's design a parking structure that can be converted to housing or office in 10 years. It's a nice idea, except that imagine your converted parking garage trying to compete with somebody's new purpose-built housing or office in 10 years. It's not going to compete, and it's going to turn out to be a much more expensive way to try and create the space that somebody else can create much more competitively and less expensively. Long story short, don't build it in the first place. I hope that's a relevant answer. Eric, did you want to?
Let me add to what David was saying. I think one additional important element to what David is describing is being able to have the capacity support to communicate to financial institutions that the reduction of parking is a good thing. Because some financial institutions will say, well, it doesn't matter what you say. I need you to have 200 parking spaces when you may only need 50. So it's important to be able to make that case to them to show why financing this project actually makes sense, to sort of get them out of the thinking, because they're sort of running their own financial models in terms of what they think they should finance and what their parking requirements should be. So you need to be able to have the support, whether it's consultants or whatever, to help combat that from financial institutions that developers are working with, because developers will say, well, I need to have this parking because my financing source is saying I need it. Despite what I said in terms of wanting to reduce it, my financing source says I need it. You need to have the support to back you up, or to help back that developer to counter what the financial source is going to say. I'll just leave with that.
Yeah. This may be a project that Eric will be asked to permit in the next year or two, but we did, you just reminded me of it, we did a charrette for just a couple of days for a 2 million square foot project in Dallas, sort of right between downtown and midtown near the cultural sort of district. And it wasn't getting much excitement. The city wasn't excited about it. Basically, it was 4 office buildings along a street, a bunch of parking structures, et cetera. It just wasn't what people really envisioned. After 2 days later, we came out of that with, it had 5,000 parking spaces. 2 days out of that, 2 days later, we came out, produced a vision, a plan for 3 million square feet, not 2 million, with the same 5,000 parking spaces, but now it had 1,000 units of housing. The 1,000 units of housing supported lots of cool retail on the ground floors and some arts and culture and other great stuff, some great public spaces. And this was a project people loved. What we had to do, the key was about a 20-minute conversation between our urban mobility person who really knows shared parking strategies and where they've been implemented and could provide the data, and the developer to provide the ammunition to take to the folks who were doing the equity financing. And it worked.
Yep.
So good luck, Eric. Hope you get to approve.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So let's comment here. Not a question, but these 3 speakers need to be back for part 2. This is fabulous information. So we'll talk to you about that. Excellent. We've been talking with them about it too. So with that, I'll just open it for any kind of closing comments before we end today.
Well, let me start with it. I would say that this is a challenging time, but also think it's an opportunity to bring to the table some creative ideas. I'm sort of excited about what the opportunities could be, and I would just encourage everyone to start to think about things they haven't thought about before. You can use the concept of pilots to test some creative ideas. Demonstration project, demonstration initiatives to start to test and change some of the trajectory in our communities. So I just wanted to conclude by saying it's a challenging time, but it's also a great time to test and bring new ideas. And that's really what I think our communities need now and going into the future. So I'll end with that.
I guess my only added comment would be to riff off of what Eric just said and say, even before COVID and before the murder of George Floyd, it was this is a challenge, has been and will be a challenging period for suburbs. But in the same spirit, this is a period of literally unprecedented opportunity for suburbs to rethink themselves going forward in ways that can or cannot leave a blade of grass untouched in everybody's front lawn. That's another discussion, but can produce much livelier, more inclusive, and I think, frankly, marketable environments going forward, as well as just and equitable. So thank you for your attention.
I'm going to leave it at that. You're the 2 main speakers here, and I don't want to add anything to that. We'll end it with that.
Great. Well, thank you all. And thanks to everybody for being here today. This will conclude our webinar, Just Suburbs, Creating Equitable Opportunities in Suburban Development. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Jason, David, and Eric for a great discussion, to all who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. And please look for this follow-up email if you need that. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye out on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including Pedaling Through Pandemic, How E-Cycling Can Keep Post-COVID Cities Moving, with Melissa Bruntlett and Chris Bruntlett, author of Building the Cycling City, the Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality, which will be next Thursday, and Farms Under Threat, the State of the States, with Julia Friedgood, Mitch Hunter, and Jennifer Dempsey of the American Farmland Trust, which will be on July 21st. Visit smartgrowth.org and watch for our blast for more information, and have a great day.